welcome to the Scott Ritter Show, episode 9. This morning, Russian President Vladimir Putin convened a meeting of the National Security Council. At that time, the Russian president declared that Ukraine had no intention of negotiating a settlement to the ongoing conflict. Moreover, the Ukrainians had been engaged in terrorist activities, most recently the attack against the Crimea Bridge. And as a result of this, the Russian president, enacted several decisions, first and foremost of which was a declaration of martial law in the 4 recently acquired, absorbed oblasts or regions of Ukraine, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, which are now part of the Russian Federation. He also talked about the creation of a special military commission that would oversee the war effort. This direct parallel, I think, comes to the GKO, or General Military Commission, that was created by Stalin on the day after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. A similar concept, the consolidation of leadership, the consolidation of decision-making into a singular body that would focus its efforts on providing support to the special military operation, or more specifically, the new unified command under General Surovikin. This is a fundamental departure from where Russia was this time yesterday. Yes, there was a partial mobilization, 300,000 troops, a reservist brought into active service to reinforce the special military operation. Yes, there was the initiation of what appears to be a concerted strategic air campaign designed to shut down the Ukrainian energy grid, to disrupt Ukrainian decision-making, Ukrainian logistics. And yes, there's a new General Armageddon, in charge. But the old way still was held hostage to a large bureaucratic system that, from many points of perspective, was not operating in a prime fashion. It was less than optimal. No longer. With creating this special military commission, it appears that President Putin, together with his prime minister and other Russian leadership, have committed to, if not a war, they didn't declare war, at least a warlike environment, that this special military operation is now going to get the full attention of the Russian Federation from every level. And I think this is going to result in some, if not dramatic, at least decisive change in the way Russia prosecutes this current conflict. Gone are the, I'm not going to say haphazard, but the less than focused efforts of the special military operation. Now it appears that Russia is behind this effort 100%, not just in terms of the moral support provided by the Russian people, but now it's the moral support backed by the organized and concentrated weight and power of the Russian government, of the Russian Federation. Does this mean that the conflict is over? What does the future hold? You know, whenever I, as an American who sits thousands of miles away from the ongoing conflict, ask these questions, I turn to certain sources in the Russian Federation for guidance. I read their works, and a person whose works that I read on a regular basis is Vladislav Surovikin, a Russian writer, an author, a historian, a military veteran. And we turn to him today to talk about this situation and other related topics. So I'd like to introduce today my guest on this show, Mr. Vladislav Surovikin. Welcome, sir. It's an honor and a privilege to have you. You heard my introduction, and so the question...
I'm also following what you are writing, I'm following what you are saying, and I like whatever you say, as you're my colleague in the military affairs.
Well, thank you very much. Well, hopefully between the two of us, we'll be able to provide some insight into this new state of affairs that exists. Well, first of all, I have to ask you, do you agree with me? Is this a new state of affairs? Am I overstating what happened today, or is this just more of the same, yet another phase in what seems to be an endless conflict? Am I right in my assessment, or am I wrong?
Вы правы, потому что история, начавшаяся в
But in
сентябре,
a sense that what started back in September, the counteroffensive of Ukraine highlighted all the deficiencies that have been accumulated over these months. There are several rules that we, the military, know for sure. One of the rules is that with all technical opportunities being equal, you cannot defeat an enemy who outnumbers you dramatically. We started our special military operation as a police operation, as a police raid, and the main plans were related, as far as I understand it, that the Ukrainian resistance would be totally different, of a different nature. These are the questions that we have to ask to the military intelligence, not to the Ministry of Defense, because, as I understand it, the military suggested a totally different campaign, both in shape and in terms of the timeline. And end of the day, we came up with what has been that was proposed by the military, fighting against a very serious enemy which is being supported by its allies in the West and in the United States, supplying weapons and technologies. And despite these deficiencies, still, because of our military excellences, we managed to go on the offensive against an enemy who outnumbered us several times. And still, these 6 months brought about the tiredness of the people. People got tired, and Ukraine started mobilization much earlier than we did. And Ukraine at that time had 4.5 times more troops than Russia had. And near Lviv, it managed to set up a reserve corps because of the Western supplies. It equipped it very well and took advantage of the Russian offensive or defensive line being so stretched, it made a counter-offensive. The first strike was made against Kherson, but it was rejected, and then auxiliary strike near Kharkiv, all of a sudden for Ukrainians was a success because our lines were much thinner, and in the time to come we had to address the crisis that emerged. And end of October, end of September, early October, the situation stabilized, but still the enemy was outnumbering us. And also the enemy outnumbered us in intelligence, outperformed us in terms of logistics, because NATO and the United States assumed that role of being provider of that data. Therefore, the police operation was no longer valid, was no longer possible, and then a decision was taken to start mobilization, to increase the number of troops. And also the overall commander of operations was appointed, Mr. Surovikin, an excellent general who performed very well. And as I said, today's stage would be totally different in terms of quality, and it would be crucial, it would be decisive. I think that this stage will provide an answer to the question whose plans and whose tactics would prevail.
Thank you for that. When we listened to the President Putin's presentation, one of the things that jumped out was his decision to institute a regime of martial law in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Lugansk, Donetsk, and expanded security arrangements in neighboring provinces, Crimea, etc. What does this mean? Why impose martial law? Is this a suppression of the Russian population? What purpose does martial law serve to the larger military objective?
Я думаю, что скорее это все-таки можно
I
назвать
think
как
that this is
приведением
something that we can call
ситуации де-факто к ситуации
what used to be a de facto situation, now it is a de jure situation. In essence, the military law
в Херсоне,
in Kherson, in Zaporizhia,
оно действует
Donetsk and Luhansk
на Донбассе вообще
was there
И тем не менее сохранялись
for
все это
all the
время
8
так или
months of
иначе
the special military operation. And
классические гражданские
Donetsk and
войны.
Luhansk
И
had that military law for 8 years, and still
очень много других элементов.
there were a lot
Военное
of
положение,
elements
как
of
вы
the
знаете, в этом случае
civilian
отличается от всего
life, civil
остального
life,
тем,
and
что
the military
всё
law
управление на
is
этой
totally
территории
different, meaning
полностью
that
переходит под контроль
now
военной администрации, под контроль
that would be
военных.
the
И оно
military
будет полностью
administration that
посвящено
would
ведению боевых
take the
действий.
reign, take
Соответственно,
control over the
безусловно,
situation,
будут
and
выстраиваться
all the goals
системы
would be subordinate
безопасности
to the
намного
purposes
более
of the
жесткие.
special
Я
military
говорю в первую
operation. The
очередь
security
борьбе
measures
против
would be
диверсантов,
tightened,
против
fighting against
диверсионных групп, против
saboteurs,
терроризма, который
against
Украина упорно
terrorism,
развязывает на этих
and
территориях
you know
через
that
свои
Ukraine is
агентуры.
staging a lot of terrorist
Безусловно, в этом
attacks
случае вся
on that
логистика будет
territory, and for
посвящаться
sure, logistics
работе на
would
армию,
serve
работе на
for the
конечный
purposes of
военный
working for the
результат.
army,
И,
for
конечно, это все-таки
attaining
так
the
или
ultimate
иначе
military goal.
будет позволять
End of the
собрать
day,
все ресурсы в кулак.
it will help us
Есть
to
определенные
pull all the
ограничения, с которыми
resources
столкнутся.
together.
Ну, например,
There are certain limitations and restrictions that people will have to face. It's been said
в
that
интересах ведения боевых действий
for the sake of
заходить в том числе и
combat
экспроприации,
activities and
естественно,
hostilities,
выплачивание компенсации. Но я думаю, что это речь идет,
some
допустим, к примеру,
equipment
там,
might
о
be seized.
каких-нибудь транспортных колоннах автомобильных,
For
которые
instance,
могут
it might
в
be
этом
all-terrain
случае
vehicles that can
переходить
be
под
seized from the
веками для
civilians
службы
that can be
военной.
then
Но
handed
пока
over
я
to
не
the
вижу
military,
каких-то больших
and certainly
серьезных
compensation will be paid.
отличий в том
But today,
режиме,
I don't
который до
see
этого
any
существовал,
difference
потому
between
что,
the regimen
как я уже
that
сказал,
used to be
де-факто
there
боевые
before.
действия
Because, as I
давным-давно
said,
сделали все эти районы
the hostilities
районом
made
боевых действий и районом военного
these
положения.
actually territories subjected to the martial law even before.
Okay, so if there's no change in the reality of the situation on the ground because of martial law, what about the reality of the support being provided with this new special military commission? Is this just another layer of bureaucracy that's being put on an already incompetent, incapable system? Or is this something real? Is this creation of this special military commission going to enhance Russia's ability to support the warfighter at the front?
Я думаю, что вы сейчас опять же сказали ключевой момент.
I think that again you have said a very crucial thing. For us, it is much more important to introduce some changes not on the front, because in the front we understand the scale of the problems that we're facing, and I have described them. First of all, this is about the shortage of personnel, shortage of troops because the front line is too stretched, and therefore we had to do maneuvers all the time to compensate, to offset that shortage of personnel with our military excellence, combat skills. But still, most of the problems are there in the home front. We have to change dramatically the way the industry works. The industry has to work for the military goals. The militarization, mobilization highlighted lots of deficiencies. Some of them were systemic ones. In 1990s and in North years, our military doctrine did not imply any such large-scale war. I remember the United States was preparing to have two local wars in different parts of the world. Within their military doctrine were even three such local wars, and actually we were being prepared to hold similar local wars. For instance, war in Chechnya, war in Georgia, and the army actually was changed to accommodate for those purposes. And the Soviet army was designed to fight a big European-scale war, and that system was dismantled gradually. And as a military expert, probably you heard, such Soviet notion as the sequestrated regimen, meaning that this would be the regimen with officers only, and there would be just empty barracks which had to be filled up within 2 or 3 months. This was dismantled. I think that starting from 2002 through 2014, this system was dismantled. In order to restore that, it would be too costly, so we didn't have money to do that. And when the mobilization started, we ran into the problem that we are lacking that reserves, that sequestrated regiment, so to say. In the United States, that role is being played by the reserve troops and by the other troops. And now we have to somehow do that. The defense industry now is accelerating in terms of its work, and for instance, we have to provide necessary clothing and transport and produce munitions, and it has to work very accurately, and in order to do that efficiently, the Special Coordination Commission was set up, and certainly this is similar to GKO, which was set up in 1941 by Joseph Stalin. But that Special Coordination Committee or Council has its own features. Due to the social structure of the USSR, the way the production was structured, is that work, and now we have to be more flexible. We have to take different approach. That's why I think that this is the Prime Minister who had to assume that role, to spearhead that.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to throw in a personal question here. I had prepared questions for a broader audience, but since you're discussing reservists, in the battle for Le Mans, Krasny Limon, there were 2 units that were mentioned with the abbreviation BARS, B-A-R-S, and it stands for a reserve unit out of the Southern Military District. And it appears that the BARS system actually replicated or mirrored the U.S. reserve system. How big is BARS? Is it something that's nationwide, or was it only limited to the Southern Military District? And what is a BARS unit? Is it a battalion? Is it a regiment? Can you provide any description of what the BARS system is?
Before starting mobilization, a decision was taken to deploy the volunteers battalions. These are the battalions that were set up by the regions, that were formed by the local commissariats, by the local administration. And these would be purely volunteers, the people who volunteered to fight, who said that their destiny is to defend their motherland on that territory. And setting up such battalions, that was the first step towards mobilization. At that moment, we believed that 100 such battalions would totally solve the problem of shortage of troops. Then it became obvious that even volunteers will not address that problem completely, it would only procrastinate that. And this is where the mobilization started. Certainly there is a difference between mobilized troops and the volunteer recruits, in the sense that volunteers are highly motivated. These are the people who actually volunteer to do that. And usually the volunteers are regularly the people who had some combat experience, who had certain skills, There are lots of former military who either retired or had previous combat experience, and certainly their combat skills were much better. In terms of the numbers, this is like about an infantry regiment, usually with some light weapons, no armored personnel carriers. Usually such carriers would be delegated to them, and the same is true for artillery. Artillery would also be handed over to them by some adjacent military troops. And bars, these units, proved to be very resilient, very strong soldiers who didn't concede any single meter. And let me apologize, let me add to what I have already said. Another thing, we still have that practice, meaning that despite mobilization going on, the practice of setting up such battalions has proved to be quite good, and along with mobilization and setting up these new units, engaging mobilized recruits, such battalions, bars battalions, are being set up and they're being dispatched to the front line. We have a very flexible structure, which can be characterized as a symbiosis of different systems. The Russian army works together with the contract officers, and this is complemented with the volunteers, and this would be complemented with the mobilized soldiers and military. Along with that, there are armed units of Luhansk and Donetsk who have 8-year-long experience of hostilities. Along with that, we have Wagner, private company that has assumed a very big role there. And along with that, we have a lot of volunteers there, bars, that become part of the whole system. And Sergei Surovikin, the overall commander of operations, is in charge of all of that, along with his staff.
Thank you for that. And you actually answered the question I was going to ask, so thank you. Sign of a good analyst is to predict the question. We take a look at the situation right now on the ground. The day before President Putin's speech, General Surovikin gave a press conference where he talked about the tense situation in Kherson. And he said some difficult decisions are going to have to be made. And one of those decisions was the mandatory evacuation of up to 60,000 civilians from the Kherson region. Many people on social media, which is always a very dangerous place to go for reaction, but there was almost a panic. People were saying, oh my goodness, the Russians are ready to surrender. They're preparing us for surrender. They're giving up. They're going to give up Kherson. And yet, when I look at the headlines today, the Russian soldiers haven't retreated 1 inch. They've withstood every attack. What's going on in Kherson? What can we expect? Is this the final battle of the Ukrainian offensive, or is this just the beginning of a continued offensive and Russia will be always on the defensive? Will Russia ever go on the counteroffensive?
Scott, as a professional, I will try to explain it to you in military terms. I will characterize that the following way. In September, the Reserve Corps, which was sent to fight by Ukraine, and they relied very much on that corps didn't perform well. The main strike was made against Kherson, and the auxiliary strike was made in Kharkiv. And this side strike managed to push our troops 70 to 80 kilometers back, and near Kherson they didn't perform well. Several waves of attacks did not result in anything. And the main objective that the Ukrainian troops and Zaluzhny and his staff put forward was to push the Russian troops from the right bank of the Dnieper River and to eliminate that stronghold, and to make such a local victory in that summer campaign, seizing two regions, Kherson region and several regions in Kharkiv region. That would be a victory in the eyes of the international community. And within 2 months of a counteroffensive, they lost a lot of troops, a lot of personnel, and in order to compensate for that, they now are making another reserve corps. And Zaluzhny said that he needs several groupings in order to push the Russians from everywhere. In December, that reserve corps had to be ready, but they had to put that on hold. All the reserves that they had, all the troops that were trained in the United Kingdom and in Poland, they were sent to those brigades that suffered a lot of losses, and they even sent the hardware and the military equipment from abroad to there. So it means that the Ukrainian army there next to Kherson is quite strong. It is not as strong as it used to be in September, but I think that probably they decided to make that one big general counteroffensive and try to conquer Kherson and to complete that counteroffensive. I worked in that war for all the 8 years, and as a military professional, I was very much irritated with how Ukrainian troops treated their own people, their own population. I was in Mariupol and said more than once that they are absolutely immoral. Because the Ukrainian troops pledged to defend the people, and they didn't let the local people to get evacuated or relocated from the city. So this is like having that life shield. And the tragedy of Mariupol, of Severodonetsk and other cities always. I'm a military, but I was astonished with that. I believe that this is not the way to behave. The decisions that were taken today and yesterday Surovikin spoke about that. These decisions are related to the very fact that Russia is relocating the local residents from the city. And Surovikin didn't say implicitly or explicitly that we are ready to surrender Kherson. Difficult or tough decisions. This might be about counteroffensive or maneuvering or change of the nature of the hostilities, but it doesn't mean that this is about surrender of the city. Probably he meant that we're going to fight for every single inch. I think that both the commander and the soldiers know what the price of Kherson surrender is about. The relocation of the local people, that's a humanitarian act, and that raises the bar of our army. So it means that this is a behavior of a very responsible, an adult army. We are responsible for the people who even 2 months ago were not ours, but now we are protecting them. This is the way I see that.
What happens going forward? We have the Ukrainians burning up their reserve, so to speak, in Kherson. Let's assume that the Russians can hold the line. The mobilization is ongoing. The forces will be absorbed. There's a new group of forces in Belarus, very strong. What can people expect going forward? Is this war going to stagnate for months? Is Russia going to assume the counteroffensive? And if it does assume the counteroffensive, what do you believe the goals and objectives are? Will Russia be satisfied with simply liberating the rest of Donetsk? Will Russia try to recapture Kharkov? Will Russia make a move on Odessa, Nikolaev? What happens to Western Ukraine, to this den of ultranationalism, the home of Stepan Bandera's ideology? Will Russia stand by idly if Poland decides to move on this? It's a lot of questions, but this war doesn't seem to be anywhere close to being over. What can we expect from Russia to bring to an end this special military operation?
Scott, let's play a military game, and I would be happy to offer it to that. So I'll give you the initial data. The reserves that are being formed now, out of 300,000, I think that 200,000 are the ones that will make new units, regiments and battalions. In terms of numbers, that would be about 5 to 6 army corps. And Ukraine has only one such corps, and the second one is being built. At the moment, we see an inflow of reservists out of the ones who have a lot of combat skills and who would not need any lengthy training. But that's why the units that are fighting today, they become stronger. And the failures that we see in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian troops, are related to the fact that, for instance, before, there would be a Russian battalion which would be 120 people strong. Now this is a battalion 400 people strong. And by late December, early January, the units and components which are being built somewhere in Siberia, this is the famous Russian tradition to speak about the Siberian battalions or divisions, so they will be sent to the front. So how would you dispose of those new units that are being shaped in Russia? What will be your take? How will you act?
I mean, I would, first of all, to mount an offense, I build a good defense. So I ensure that I've solidified my defensive lines. I would also make sure that the Ukrainians are always looking at Kiev. So I would make sure that I have sufficient force deployed in Belarus and in the areas in Russia that could threaten Kiev at a moment's notice or respond to any Polish move on West Ukraine. After that, I picked the point of the greatest weakness for the most rapid exploitation, perhaps because the Ukrainians advanced rapidly in Kharkov. They've repeated the same mistake the Russians did. They have their defensive lines too thinly manned. And maybe it would be appropriate at that point in time to launch an offensive out of Russia, sweeping down past Lugansk, Donetsk, and sweeping their forces towards, Zaporizhia, maybe catch them in a pocket. And then I'd move on to Odessa and secure, make sure that I've made contact with Transnistria and I take care of the 400,000 pro-Russian people that live there. But at that point in time, I pretty much expended, I believe, the responsible offensive military capacity of those forces. At that point, the frontage becomes very extensive, and to proceed further might require additional troops unless you've caused the Ukrainians to collapse, unless you've caused the political collapse of the Ukrainian government and the general surrender of the Ukrainian armed forces, in which case the war is over.
Well, thank you. I don't think that Ukraine would collapse because Ukraine is being ruled from outside, and no one would allow that political crisis or that collapse during the war. I think that they will try to support it. And I totally agree with you. I agree that the military outcomes cannot be limited to just defeating the troops in Donbass. You quite correctly said that. Without cutting Ukraine off the Black Sea, it would be very difficult to deindustrialize it. If Ukraine still has an exit to the Black Sea, this would be the state that would perform and develop quite well. If we cut Ukraine off the Black Sea, if Nikolaev, Odessa and other southern lands are being controlled by Russia, if we make a corridor to Transnistria, certainly Ukraine would be in much more difficult situation. But you absolutely correctly said that then the front line would be too stretched and you will eat up all your reserves. And that means that we'll have to mobilize more troops if at certain stage a decision is taken to continue the military campaign. I think that one of the main objectives would be to free the left bank territories on the left bank. And probably you have the same notion as the nearest objective and the further objective. When, for instance, there is an offensive, then there is the immediate task and the subsequent tasks, so to say. I think that the immediate task for the special military operation is to free the left bank territory of Ukraine. And then, subsequently, two things have to be performed. We have to deindustrialize Ukraine, meaning that we have to somehow make a corridor to Transnistria and to pose the threat to Kiev. Not necessarily. We will have to start hostility. There might be some big unit, some big component threatening Kiev, and this is something that would force Kiev to make political concessions, or at least to sit at the negotiations table. For me, as the military, it would be ideal if we defeat the centers, the birthplaces of Nazism. I was born in Ukraine. I graduated from a military school there in Ukraine. I know the mentality of these people. Even amid the propaganda, that part of people who are being ruled by Zelensky, that part still is not homogeneous. It still includes three types of Ukraine, three types of mentality, what is called Galicia, or the Western Oblast or regions, the motherland of Nazism, then Hetman Ukraine. This is Poltava, Kiev, the central part of Ukraine with its own mentality, and the eastern part of Ukraine, which also has its own mentality. And it has a lot of Russian-speaking people who nevertheless are fighting against us, but still there is a vast difference, a big difference. And in case of a major defeat, these fractures would become wider, just like they worked until 2014. There was a major strife within Ukraine. I think that until spring, the immediate task would be to defeat the main troops of the Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass and to get to the Dnieper. As for other subsequent tasks, I'm not in the position to do that. I'm not a visionary. I'm not telling the future, and I'm lacking the data to use that. I'm not a member. I don't have any sources in the general staff. I do not know their maps.
Well, that's too bad, because we'd like to dig into that knowledge, but I understand the sensitivities of that regardless. Look, we'll finish with a very serious note. I mean, not that war isn't serious, but conventional war, we all know and we all understand. Nuclear war is a whole different level. And as we speak right now, NATO is carrying out a nuclear exercise, Steadfast Noon, where they are training on how to employ nuclear weapons using air power, B-52 bombers, F-16 fighters, F-35 fighters. Russia has responded by carrying out its own nuclear exercises. Grom, I think, is the name of it, exercising their strategic nuclear deterrent force. President Biden recently said that, from his point of view, the current situation we face is the most fraught with danger since the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we've never been this close to, and he used the term, a nuclear Armageddon. The West believes that Russia is in a desperate situation, preparing to use tactical nuclear weapons against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian president, in the aftermath of the Russian decision to mobilize, panically asked NATO to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. People are concerned. What is the risk, from your point of view, of the current conflict turning nuclear? Twofold. One, is Russia losing so badly that it has no choice but to use nuclear weapons to change the reality on the battlefield? Or two, is Russia winning so decisively that NATO will have no choice but to use nuclear weapons to stop a Russian victory? Or is there a third option? Over to you, sir.
Well, looking into the scenario of using nuclear arms, I made several analyses. First of all, I don't see any option that the tactical nuclear weapons would be used in Ukraine. First of all, this is due to certain commitments that Russia took. Russia several times committed itself and stated several times that it will not use nuclear arms against a country that doesn't have any such nuclear weapons. Secondly, we don't see any crisis in the front that would require such actions. Ukrainian counteroffensive, this is just a local counteroffensive that even failed to attain the strategical objective it was initiated for. So it means that once we pull our forces together, we will build up our potential. And in order to do that, not necessarily we will have to use nuclear weapons. And our artillery is quite strong there. So we have enough guns, we have enough munition, we have enough jets. And what we are lacking, we're short of infantry, we're short of troops. We're short of personnel, that's it. Secondly, I see a danger of a global nuclear war as a military expert. I understand that clearly. Certainly, military support for Ukraine may, at some stage, result in the fact that its Western allies would cross certain red lines. For instance, Ukraine has a shortage of anti-aircraft systems. They are running out of surface-to-air missiles. Russia is using very cheap Iranian-type drones called Geran or Shahid, and therefore the anti-aircraft systems are being destroyed very easily. Before, we didn't manage to do that because the European style or the Russian style anti-aircraft systems mainly were designed to down aircrafts, jets, very big ones. And now they have to try to reject such cheap drones. It's very difficult to intercept that. And for instance, such a drone would cost about $1,000, and you have to spend a missile which costs $100,000. This is just like making a toilet using golden nails, gold nails. And that's a very serious crisis for Ukraine. Who would take care of the Ukrainian anti-aircraft system? Probably. Poland may try to do that, saying that it works on its own, and it has nothing to do with Article 5 of NATO. But still someone has to defend the skies, so to say. At the moment, the United States and American aircrafts are providing intelligence data and reconnaissance data to Ukraine about any UAV, but how to down them? The number of anti-aircraft systems will not be capable of downing all the drones, let alone the cruise missiles which are being produced and which are being launched by Russia as well. And so it means that that situation may change the situation, may become a game changer in a couple of months. And speaking to our prankers, and probably you're familiar with that, Mr. Pashinsky, in Ukraine, he's head of Association of the Military Industry, talking to the Russian prankers, believing he's talking to former ex-US ambassador Makful. He said that there is a disastrous situation with the anti-aircraft systems in Ukraine. And sorry for speaking too long, but the threat is that the United States and NATO would be dragged into that conflict. First implicitly, then more explicitly, and we know that there are American instructors training Ukrainian troops in Lvov, but this is not a direct involvement. And still, the Western allies may bet on defeating Russia at any cost. It may result in the situation that you have mentioned. If Russia faces no other choice to win a war than to make such a nuclear ultimatum, I have no doubts that Russia will resort to nuclear weapons. The countries that have nuclear weapons cannot be defeated, but probably there might be an ultimatum set for Russia, and in that case, the Russian political leaders and the Russian military command would say, okay, you decided to win that war at any cost, to corner Russia, and in that case we have an alternative. Either we exchange nuclear strikes and then let the God Almighty decide who is the winner, or we sit immediately at the negotiations table and decide how to put this conflict to an end. And this is very unlikely that even the American military would say that Russia is bluffing. You know that the last stage between resorting to the nuclear weapons, there might be some showcase nuclear explosions, so that no one has doubts that really we are on the brink of a nuclear war. So I think that now we are facing a very serious challenge, a very serious threat. I do believe that we will not cross that line, and it will not be something beyond that nuclear ultimatum. Why? Russia has a very vast territory, it has its own self-sufficiency, and even nuclear doomsday will not be an end to the civilization. But for the United States, which also is a huge civilization and will survive through that disaster, it would be a total tragedy for that, because it would be the end of the American-style world. There are lots of zones in the world that would necessitate American policy, permanent American presence, American support. And once the United States is removed from that area, then the consequences would be very far-reaching. So I do think that the threat of that large-scale conflict is there, but it would be restricted to an ultimatum. Otherwise, the world will not be the one we remember it.
Well, on that sobering note, I want to thank you very much for coming here today, for sharing your expertise. I think anybody who tuned in today gained extensive insight and knowledge and understanding of the ongoing conflict. So, again, I extend my greatest appreciation for Vladislav Surovikin, a Russian historian, a writer, a war correspondent, and a combat veteran. And I want to thank you, the audience, for tuning in. Episode 9, remember, knowledge is power.